In the year 1471, a Vietnamese emperor named Le Thun Tong marched 250,000 soldiers south, along a narrow strip of coast between the mountains and the sea. He was hunting a kingdom that had stood for 1,279 years. By the time his army left, the capital city of Vickery was burning. 40,000 of its citizens were dead. 30,000 more, priests, dancers, masons, scholars, were walking north in chains. And the king of that kingdom was dying on the road, in a cart, somewhere between his ruined capital and the city of his conquerors. But here is the part most history books leave out. By the time Vickery burned, this kingdom had already been dying for 1,000 years. Not in one battle. Not in one season. 1 inch at a time. 1 village at a time. 1 generation at a time. This is the story of Champa, a Hindu civilization that built temples to rival Angkor, and then was slowly, quietly, almost gently absorbed into the country we now call Vietnam. A kingdom that did not vanish overnight. A kingdom that vanished over 36 generations. To understand Champa, you have to understand the strangest piece of geography in Southeast Asia. A narrow ribbon of land. 1,000 kilometers long. In some places, only 50 kilometers wide. Mountains on one side. The South China Sea on the other. Today, this is central Vietnam, the coast from Da Nang down to Phan Thiet. But 2,000 years ago, there was no Vietnam here. There were people. But they were not the ancestors of the modern Vietnamese. They came from somewhere else entirely. If you trace the language they spoke, you find something surprising. It belongs to a family called Austronesian, the same family as Malay, Indonesian, Tagalog, and the languages of Madagascar. These people did not come down from the mountains of southern China, like the Vietnamese did. They came by sea, in canoes, from the islands of what is now Indonesia and the Philippines, sometime around 2,000 years ago. They called themselves the Cham. In the year 192 AD, while the Roman Empire was at its peak in the west, a Cham leader whose name has come down to us as Sri Mara rose against the Chinese commanderies that had been imposed on his people. He won. And he founded a kingdom that Chinese historians would call Lin Yi. The Cham would call it the first of many names. The kingdom would survive, in one form or another, for the next 1,640 years. That is longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire, from its founding to its fall. And longer than every dynasty of imperial China combined. The Cham were sailors. They were traders. And they sat on one of the richest trade routes on earth. Ships from Arabia and Persia and India and China all passed through their waters. The Cham sold them fresh water, aromatic woods, agarwood, and eaglewood, substances so fragrant that wealthy Chinese emperors burned them by the kilogram in their palaces. The Cham grew rich. They built ports. The ancient harbor that lies beneath the old town of Hoi and today was once a Cham trading post, busier than any port in mainland Southeast Asia. And then, sometime in the 3rd century, something arrived in their ports that would change them forever. Indian merchants. With Indian gods. With Indian scripts. With the architectural idea of the Temple Mountain, a building meant to imitate the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe. The Cham accepted all of it. They became Hindu. They learned Sanskrit. They began to carve their kings' names into stone in a script borrowed from southern India. By the year 300 AD, the kings of Champa worshipped Shiva. They called him by a local name, Bhadresvara. They believed their kings were Shiva on earth. And they began to build him a city of temples in a small, mist-filled valley between the mountains. They called the valley Misun. For 900 years, 900, successive Cham kings built temples at Misun. Every new king added a new shrine. Every new dynasty added a new cluster. By the time construction stopped, in the 13th century, the valley held more than 70 brick towers, surrounded by walls, gates, and processional ways. The towers were built of red brick the color of dried blood, rising out of the green of the jungle like fingers pointing at a god. And the bricks themselves were a problem. Because there was no mortar between them. Archaeologists have studied Cham brickwork for over 100 years, and they still do not fully understand how it was done. The bricks fit together so tightly that a knife blade cannot be pushed between them. The current theory is that the Cham used a thin paste made from the resin of the zo rai tree, a tropical hardwood, as a kind of organic glue. But no one has been able to fully reproduce the technique. For comparison, the Khmer Empire, which would build Angkor 700 years later, used stone blocks held together with their own weight. The Cham worked in brick, and their brick has outlasted Cambodia stone. While the Cham were building me son, they were also writing. In the year 192 AD, possibly earlier, they began carving stone pillars with inscriptions in Sanskrit. One of them, the Vokhan stele, found in the province of Khan Hua, is among the oldest Sanskrit inscriptions ever discovered anywhere outside of India. Let me say that again. Some of the earliest written Sanskrit in the entire world is not in India. It is in Vietnam, and it was carved by the Cham. By the 9th century, Champa was at its peak. A king named Indyaravarman II moved his capital to a town called Indyarapura, the city of Indra, and built there the largest Buddhist monastery in Southeast Asia. The complex at Dong Xuang covered nearly half a square kilometre. Its monks studied texts brought from the great Buddhist universities of India. Its courtyards held thousands. When the Khmer king Sowayavarman II began construction of Angkor Wat in the year 1113 AD, the Cham had already been building temple mountains for 800 years. Many of the masons who worked on Angkor are believed to have learned their craft in Champa. In their workshops, Cham sculptors produced stonework of breathtaking quality. Dancing apsaras, 8-armed gods, sea serpents, lions, and lingers. Pieces of it still exist today, in the Museum of Cham Sculpture in Da Nang. 500 sculptures, in one building, from one civilization. Champa was not a single kingdom. It was a federation. 5 smaller kingdoms, called mandalas, scattered along the coast, Indyarapura, Amaravati, Vjya, Kautara, and Pāṇḍuranga. Sometimes one king ruled all 5. Sometimes 5 kings ruled 5. The federation was loose. Power shifted with the monsoons. It was beautiful. It was rich. It was old. And in the year 939 AD, something happened far to the north that would change everything. A general named Ngo Quyen defeated a Chinese fleet on the Bac Dang River. Vietnam declared its independence from 1,000 years of Chinese rule. And just like that, Champa had a new neighbor to the north. Not the Tang dynasty of China, comfortably distant, satisfied with tribute, but a young, hungry, land-poor Vietnamese kingdom, looking for somewhere to grow. They were looking south. The first attack came in the year 982 AD. A Vietnamese emperor named Lê Hoan, only the second king of the new independent Vietnam, marched into Champa, sacked the capital of Indyarapura, and took home 1,000 prisoners and an Indian Buddhist monk. That set the pattern. For the next 500 years, every Vietnamese dynasty, the early Lê, the Lý, the Tran, the Ho, the later Lê, would, at some point in its history, invade Champa. The Champa kings invaded back. They burned the new Vietnamese capital at Thang Long, what we now call Hanoi, more than once. But the math was always against them. Champa was long and thin. Vietnam was deep and growing. Every Vietnamese village settled further south meant a little less Champa. In 1044, the Lý Emperor Lý Tai Tong sacked Vjya, the southern Cham capital. He took the king's chief consort, a Cham princess named Mi A, prisoner. On the boat ride north, she wrapped herself in a robe and threw herself into the Chao Giang River rather than enter the Vietnamese court. In 1069, another Lý emperor, Lý Thun Tong, with his famous general Lý Thuong Kiet, sacked Vjya again. They captured the Cham king Rudravarman III, called Che Ku by Vietnamese historians. The king bargained for his freedom. The price was 3 provinces in the north of Champa. He paid it. Champa had lost 1/5 of its territory in a single ransom. In 1306, a Vietnamese princess named Nguyen Tran was sent south to marry a Cham king named Che Mun. The dowry, from her side, was nothing. The dowry, from his side, was 2 more provinces, the modern provinces of Tua Tien Huari and the northern half of Da Nang. Champa had lost another 1/5. Without a battle. Just a wedding. But the Cham were not finished. In 1360, a king came to the throne of Champa who would refuse to lose. His name was Che Bong Nga. In Cham, Po Bnsor. He was, by every account, a brilliant general. He raised an army. He built a fleet. And he turned the entire arithmetic of the war upside down. In 1371, he sailed up the coast and burned the Vietnamese capital of Thang Long to the ground. The Tran emperor fled the city. 6 years later, in 1377, he did it again. The emperor of Vietnam, Tran Xuê Tông, died in the burning of his own capital. In 1378, For the third time in 7 years, the king of Champa rode through the smoking ruins of Hanoi. The Vietnamese chroniclers, writing decades later, could barely contain their dread. For a moment in the late 14th century, it seemed possible that Champa, small, southern, ancient Champa, would conquer Vietnam. Then, in 1390, on a river in northern Vietnam, Che Bong Nga was aboard his command boat directing a battle. A Vietnamese soldier on the bank, using a hand cannon, one of the earliest firearms ever fired in Asia, shot him through the body. He died in minutes. The momentum of Champa died with him. For the next 80 years, the kings who followed could not hold what he had built. And then, in 1471, came Lê Thun Tông, the army of 250,000, the fall of Vjya, the 40,000 dead, the 30,000 taken in chains. When the Vietnamese army left, Champa was no longer a kingdom. It was a refugee. Here is what most histories of Vietnam will tell you. They will say that Champa fell in 1471. That is not true. Champa fell for another 361 years. After 1471, what remained of the kingdom retreated south, into the dry, hot lowlands of Pāṇḍuranga, the modern provinces of Ninh Thuan and Binh Thuan. A king still ruled there. Temples were still built. Inscriptions were still carved. But every generation, the borders of Champa shrank a little further south. In 1611, the Vietnamese Lord Nguyen Huang established the new province of Phu Yen on land that had been Champa a generation earlier. In 1653, his successor took Can Hoa. In 1693, Lord Nguyen Phuc Chu arrested the Chum king Po Saktire de Puti and renamed his kingdom Tran Tuan Thun, the compliant border district. The Chum king was allowed to keep his throne. But he reported to the Vietnamese now. Champa had stopped being a country. It had become an administrative unit. This is the strange middle period, almost 140 years, when Champa existed and did not exist at the same time. A kingdom inside another kingdom. A king under a king. And then, in 1832, the Vietnamese Emperor Minh Mang, a centralizer, a modernizer, a Confucian reformer, decided the arrangement was untidy. He abolished the Principality of Tuan Thun. He arrested the last Chum king, Po Phac Tay. He erased Champa from the map of his empire. There had been a kingdom called Champa for 1,640 years. After 1832, there was not. But here is the part that makes Champa unlike almost any other lost civilization. The Cham did not vanish. They are still here. Today, in the provinces of Ninh Thuan and Binh Thuan, the old heartland of Pāṇḍuranga, about 170,000 people identify as Cham. They live in villages within sight of the ancient brick towers their ancestors built. Many of them still speak the Cham language, a language with roots 1,000 years older than Vietnamese. They write it in 2 alphabets. One, called Akar Tra, descends directly from the same Indian script that the kings of Champa used in the 7th century. The other is the Latin alphabet, adapted in the 20th century. The Cham split, sometime in the 16th century, into 2 religious communities. Most remained Hindu, worshipping Shiva and the local kings as gods. Others became Muslim, following traders who came from the Malay world. You can drive, today, from a Cham Hindu village in Ninh Thuan to a Cham Muslim village in Binh Thuan in less than 2 hours. They speak the same language. They share the same ancestors. They have not lived under the same king in 500 years. The most extraordinary thing is the Tower of Po Klong Garai. It stands on a small hill outside the city of Phan Rang. It was built around the year 1300 AD by a Chum king named Jya Simhavaman III. It is the only Chum tower in the world where ritual has never stopped. 4 times a year, Chum priests, called Acharya, climb the hill, enter the tower, and perform ceremonies dedicated to the deified King Po Klong Garai. Offerings are laid. Mantras are spoken. The same ones that have been spoken there, in some form, for 700 years. No interruption. No revival. Just continuous, quiet, unbroken devotion. Once a year, in the 7th month of the Chum calendar, the community celebrates Ka Tay, a festival of remembrance for the ancestors and the old kings. Thousands gather at the tower. Women wear ceremonial robes. Musicians play instruments whose designs have not changed in centuries. To a visitor, it looks like a festival. To the Chum, it is something closer to memory. In 1999, UNESCO declared Misan a World Heritage Site. It was the first World Heritage Site in Vietnam. But the recognition came late. In August 1969, during the Vietnam War, American B-52 bombers had dropped explosives on the valley, mistaking the ancient towers for a guerrilla position. 20 of the 70 towers were destroyed in a single morning. What survives at My Son today is roughly 1/3 of what stood there in the year 1500. And so we are left with a question. One that the Piu did not force us to ask. The Cham still live. Their towers still stand. Their language is still written. Their priests still climb the hill at Pāṇḍuranga 4 times every year. But Champa, the kingdom, the federation of 5 mandalas, the brick city in the mountain valley, the king who burned Hanoi 3 times, Champa is gone. So did Champa vanish? Or did it survive? Perhaps this is a different kind of forgetting from the one that killed the Piu. The Piu died in a single generation. Their language disappeared. Their script became unreadable. Their descendants stopped being Piu within 200 years. The Cham did the opposite. They are still Cham. But the country called Champa was eroded out from under them, century by century, until one morning in 1832 it was simply not there anymore. A people can outlive their nation. A nation can vanish while its people stand in the doorway, watching. There is an inscription at the temple of Pāṇḍuranga, on a hill above the city of Nha Trang, carved in the 11th century in Sanskrit. Much of it is broken. Much of it is unreadable. But one line has survived. It reads, "The lotus pond has perished. The fragrance is gone. And memory no longer dwells there." The pond, in the inscription, was a metaphor for the kingdom. But the descendants of the people who carved those words are still in those villages. Still in those towers. Still climbing the hill 4 times a year. Memory dwells there. Just not, perhaps, the kind anyone was expecting. If you enjoyed this story, there are more lost civilizations waiting. In the next video, we'll travel north, to a riverbank in the heart of Sichuan, China, where archaeologists in 1986 dug into a sacrificial pit and found the bronze masks of a civilization that left no name, no writing, and no history. We'll tell you what we know about Sanxingdui, and what we have agreed, for 30 centuries, to forget. Subscribe so you don't miss it.